when I rolled a rusted half-dead 1960 Rolls Royce Silver Cloud into my driveway. My HOA neighbors thought I'd lost my mind. That junk doesn't belong here. Karen, the HOA president, barked across the street, clutching her clipboard like a weapon. But what she didn't know was that this broken beauty once belonged to my late grandfather, a war veteran, and one of the original owners of that very neighborhood. I spent months restoring it with my bare hands, turning the decaying metal into a masterpiece of chrome and pride. But the moment I started polishing the hood ornament, Karen marched over and claimed it was abandoned property. She even called the police, insisting the Rolls belonged to her association. What started as a simple car restoration turned into a full-blown neighborhood war, one that ended with Karen learning exactly who she was messing with. Asterisk, the morning I brought the Rolls Royce home, the neighborhood went quiet. You could almost hear the collective gasp as the tow truck backed into my driveway, lowering what looked like a heap of corroded metal onto the pavement. The old 1960 Silver Cloud was missing its front grille. One headlight hung loose, and the paint was so faded it looked like dull cement. I could already see a few curtains twitching from across the street. And then there she was, Karen, the self-appointed queen of the glaring at me with her arms folded tight against her floral blouse. To anyone else, it was just a pile of junk. But to me it was a promise, a living connection to my grandfather. When I was a kid, he used to take me on Sunday drives in his Silver Cloud, telling me stories about craftsmanship, patience, and the importance of finishing what you start. After he passed, the garage felt emptier than ever. I made myself a vow that one day I'd find the same model and restore it in his memory. So when I stumbled upon a rusted shell of that exact car at a state auction, I didn't think twice. It wasn't about the money or the effort. It was about bringing a piece of him back to life. The tow truck driver gave me a sympathetic smile as he handed me the paperwork. "You sure you want to sink your time into this old beast?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. I just smiled back. "It's not about what it looks like now," I said. "It's about what it used to be." He shrugged and drove off, leaving me with the sound of the metal groaning under its own weight. I walked around the car, brushing my hand over the hood. Even through the grime, I could see the ghost of its former shine. That's when Karen came strutting over, clipboard in hand. Her heels clicked sharply on the pavement like a judge announcing a sentence. "Excuse me," she said, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "What exactly is that doing here?" I turned to her, trying to stay polite. "That," I said with a grin, "is a Rolls Royce Silver Cloud. I'm restoring it." She looked at it as if it might spread disease. "Restoring? This is a residential neighborhood, not a junkyard. You can't just park wrecked vehicles out here." I took a breath. "It's not a wreck. It's a project. I'll keep it clean and quiet," she huffed, scribbling something on her clipboard. "I'll have to check the HOA regulations. We have rules against unregistered vehicles and unsightly property." Then she walked off, shaking her head like she was disappointed in me for daring to dream. That night, I sat in my garage staring at the car, replaying my grandfather's voice in my mind. "Every great thing looks broken before it's fixed," he used to say. I smiled to myself, grabbed my toolbox, and got to work. The first few nights were rough. The bolts were rusted solid, the wiring looked like spaghetti, and every part I touched seemed to crumble. But I didn't stop. I cleaned the carburetor, replaced the plugs, sanded the body, and scrubbed away years of neglect. Slowly, piece by piece, the Silver Cloud began to reveal hints of its old dignity. Of course, Karen didn't make it easy. Every morning, she'd pass by with her little dog, making sure to stop and inspect my progress, or rather, to find something to complain about. One morning, she snapped a photo of the car and muttered, "I'll be reporting this." I just smiled and kept sanding. The engine was already halfway functional by then, and that tiny victory kept me going. A few of my other neighbors started to notice too. Old Mr. Jenkins from across the street came over one evening with a cup of coffee. "That's quite a car you got there," he said. "My dad used to drive one like it. Don't let that woman scare you off. This place could use a little history." That encouragement was all I needed. I worked harder, longer, sometimes past midnight, tightening, polishing, restoring. It was more than a project now. It was therapy. Every hour I spent under that hood felt like time spent with my grandfather again. But Karen's patience was wearing thinner by the day. A week later, I found a bright orange sticker plastered to the windshield. "Notice of violation, unapproved vehicle storage." My stomach sank. She'd actually done it. I peeled it off, crushed it in my fist, and looked around. Karen was standing on her porch, sipping coffee like she'd just saved the neighborhood from ruin. I decided I wouldn't let her win. I went straight to the county office and made sure the car was properly registered, insured, and documented as a historical restoration project. When I came home, I framed the paperwork and hung it in my garage. The next time Karen came by, clipboard ready, I handed her a copy. "Everything's legal," I said, smiling. She looked like she'd swallowed a lemon, but that only made her more determined. The next day, she sent me an email claiming the car violated community aesthetic standards. I laughed out loud. She didn't realize she'd just lit a fuse. If she thought a few forms and complaints could make me give up my grandfather's dream, she didn't know me at all. That night, I turned on the garage lights, rolled up my sleeves, and worked until the sunrise painted the hood in gold. For the first time, The silver cloud looked alive again. Scarred, yes, but proud. And as I stood there, wiping the grease from my hands, I whispered softly, "We're just getting started, Grandpa." Karen had no idea the storm she'd just invited into her tidy little kingdom. The morning sun glared off the chrome bumper of the silver cloud as I rolled it out of the garage, proud of how far it had come. The engine finally turned over with a low, satisfying rumble, the kind of sound that made every long night of work worth it. I leaned against the hood, wiping the sweat from my forehead, when I caught sight of Karen pacing across her lawn, talking animatedly into her phone. Even from a distance, I could tell she was complaining. Her free hand waved toward my driveway like she was directing air traffic. I sighed. It seemed my progress wasn't just visible, it was infuriating her. That afternoon, I received a formal letter taped to my door. The HOA letterhead glared at me like a warning sign. It read, "You are in violation of community standards due to the presence of an unapproved restoration project. Please remove the vehicle from your property within 7 days, or face fines." I almost laughed. 7 days. I'd barely finished restoring the frame, and now she wanted it gone. I went straight to my garage and called the HOA office. A polite young man named Ben answered. "Hi, I'm calling about a violation notice I received," I said. He paused. "Oh yes, Mr. Turner. That was reported by the association president. She's concerned about the visual state of your vehicle." "It's a classic Rolls Royce," I replied, trying not to sound irritated. "It's not a wreck, it's a restoration, and it's fully registered." There was silence, then a hesitant. "Sir, I understand, but Mrs. Price is very particular about aesthetics." I could practically hear him rolling his eyes on the other end. Karen Price, that was her full name, though most people in the neighborhood just called her Madam Clipboard. She'd been president of the HOA for 3 straight terms, and from what I'd heard, she ran it like a private army. People were afraid to cross her because she had a way of making small inconveniences turn into expensive nightmares. Fines, letters, citations. She had a rule for everything. And now, her latest crusade was parked in my driveway. Over the next few days, she ramped up her campaign. Every time I went outside, I'd find her snapping photos of the car from different angles. One morning, she even brought 2 other board members with her. They stood there, whispering and pointing like detectives investigating a crime scene. I tried to ignore them and kept polishing the hood, but then Karen called out, "You know, this kind of eyesore really lowers our property value." I turned, still calm. "Funny, Karen, I was just reading an article about how vintage restorations increase neighborhood charm." Her face tightened like she'd just bitten into a lemon. "That's not the point," she snapped. "This neighborhood has standards." The tension escalated faster than I expected. On the 4th day, I woke up to find an orange traffic cone placed behind my car, along with another bright notice. This time it read, "Immediate removal required. Vehicle considered abandoned. I nearly choked on my coffee. I had been out there every single day working on it. I decided enough was enough. I gathered my paperwork, the title, registration, and restoration permits, and marched straight to the HOA office. Ben looked nervous when I walked in. "Oh, Mr. Turner, Mrs. Price already mentioned you might come by." I laid my documents on the desk. "Then you can tell her this car isn't abandoned, and it's completely legal." He flipped through the papers, nodding. "Everything seems fine here, sir." I smiled. "Then I expect those violation notices to stop." He nodded again, though I could tell he was too scared to promise anything. Karen's shadow loomed large even here. That evening, Karen came storming down my driveway, papers in hand. "You went behind my back," she accused. "No," I said, leaning on the car. "I went through the proper channels, something you seem to forget about." She jabbed a finger at me. "You can't just ignore community rules." I stepped closer. "And you can't make them up as you go." Her eyes flashed, but she didn't reply. She turned sharply and stomped off, her heels clicking against the pavement like gunshots. The very next day, I received an email from the city zoning department. Another complaint had been filed, this time about commercial activity on residential property. Karen was trying to claim that I was running a repair shop from my garage. I actually laughed out loud when I read it. I wasn't about to let her win with lies. I snapped photos of the car, my garage, and my residential zoning documents, then sent them all to the city inspector. The next afternoon, an inspector came by, looked around for 5 minutes, and shook his head. "I'm sorry, sir. Someone's wasting our time. You're clearly not operating a business." He chuckled. "Between you and me, we get these complaints all the time from nosy neighbors." By now, word had spread. The other residents started noticing what was really going on. Some even stopped by to admire the car and offer encouragement. "Don't let her get to you," one of them said. "She tried to find me for having sunflowers in my yard." Slowly, the tide began to turn. People were tired of Karen's control. That night, I sat in my garage again, engine humming softly, and looked at the silver cloud's reflection under the warm light. It was far from finished, but it already had a soul again. I thought of my grandfather's words. "You can't rush perfection, but you can always protect it." I smiled to myself, realizing that this restoration wasn't just about a car anymore. It was about standing up for something that mattered. for memory, for craftsmanship, for freedom. Karen thought she could scare me off with fines and threats. But she'd only given me a reason to fight harder. The silver cloud would shine again, and when it did, the whole neighborhood would see exactly what real value looked like. By the time the HOA meeting rolled around, the air in the neighborhood felt charged, like the calm before a summer storm. Word about my battle with Karen had spread faster than gossip at a barber shop. Neighbors who had never spoken to me before now waved when I drove by, and a few even stopped to chat. Most of them had their own Karen stories, tales of ridiculous fines and petty power trips. But this time, they had someone willing to stand up to her, and tonight's meeting was where that showdown would finally happen. I walked into the community hall early, wearing a clean shirt and carrying a thick folder filled with paperwork, every registration, restoration permit, and even photos documenting the progress of the silver cloud. The car wasn't just a project anymore. It was my proof that I wasn't breaking any rules. Inside the hall, a long table sat at the front with the HOA board members lined up like judges, and in the middle, wearing her signature floral blouse and smug expression, was Karen Price. She didn't look surprised to see me. In fact, she looked almost delighted, like she'd been waiting for this. "Ah, Mr. Turner," she said sweetly, her tone dripping with false politeness. "I see you've decided to join us tonight." I smiled back. Wouldn't miss it for the world. A few neighbors chuckled quietly from the back row. The meeting began as usual. Budget reports, landscaping updates, community pool repairs, all the boring stuff. But everyone knew what they were really there for. Finally, Karen cleared her throat and said, "Next on the agenda, we'll be addressing the issue of an unapproved vehicle restoration taking place at 317 Elmwood Drive." Every head turned toward me. I stood up slowly, folder in hand. Karen flipped a page on her clipboard. "It has come to the board's attention that a resident has been keeping an unregistered, unsightly vehicle in his driveway, in violation of Section 8, Article 4 of the Community Guidelines." She looked up with a smug grin. "Would the resident in question like to respond?" "I would," I said calmly. I walked to the front, opened my folder, and laid out my documents on the table. First, the car is fully registered and insured under my name. Here's proof. Second, the so-called unsightly vehicle is a 1960 Rolls Royce Silver Cloud, a classic car that I've been restoring legally, with no noise complaints, no obstruction, and no hazard to anyone. A murmur ran through the crowd. Karen glanced at the papers, clearly annoyed. "Regardless of its make or model, it doesn't comply with the community's visual standards," she insisted. "We maintain an image here." "That image," I said, meeting her eyes, "isn't about rules. It's about control. You'll find people for flower colors, mailbox paint, and now, for honoring a family memory." The audience shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded in quiet agreement. Before Karen could respond, a man from the audience stood up. It was Mr. Jenkins, the old neighbor who'd brought me coffee once. "Karen," he said, "I've lived here 20 years. That car looks better than half the SUVs parked on this street. It's a piece of history, not junk." Several people clapped. Karen's expression tightened, but she tried to maintain her composure. "Mr. Jenkins, while I appreciate your sentiment, community standards are not based on nostalgia. They are," another woman interrupted, "standards or your personal taste." "Karen, because I remember when you fined me for having a red front door." Laughter broke out across the room. Karen's jaw clenched. "This is not a popularity contest," she snapped. "No," I said, stepping forward. "It's about fairness." I pulled out an old black and white photograph from my folder. "This," I said, holding it up, "is my grandfather standing beside his silver cloud in 1961, right here in this neighborhood." I pointed to the background of the photo, the same houses, the same street, even the old oak tree, still standing in front of my home. He was one of the first residents here. The car I'm restoring isn't some random heap of metal. It's a piece of this neighborhood's history. You could feel the shift in the room. The board members exchanged looks, and a few neighbors leaned forward to get a better look at the photo. Even Karen blinked, thrown off for the first time. "That doesn't change the rule," she muttered, but her voice had lost its sharpness. "Actually," I continued, "it does because the HOA bylaws clearly state exceptions can be made for historical preservation projects that contribute to community heritage." I pointed to the highlighted section in the rulebook I'd printed. The room buzzed again. Karen's face went pale. She hadn't expected me to read her own rules better than she had. One of the other board members, a quiet man named Roger, cleared his throat. "He's right, Karen. It's in Section 10, under Community Heritage Clauses. He's not in violation." Karen froze. Her lips pressed together so tightly they turned white. For the first time in years, someone had publicly proven her wrong, and she couldn't stand it. The chairperson of the board finally spoke. "Mr. Turner, thank you for clarifying. Based on this evidence, we see no violation of community policy. The restoration may continue." Applause filled the room. It wasn't wild or loud, but it was enough to make Karen's face redden with humiliation. I nodded politely, gathered my papers, and took my seat. Karen tried to move on with the agenda, but her voice trembled. She knew she'd lost this round. After the meeting ended, several neighbors came up to shake my hand. "You handled that perfectly," one said. About time someone stood up to her. Another whispered. Mr. Jenkins clapped me on the shoulder. Your granddad would be proud. As I stepped outside, the night air felt lighter, freer somehow. I looked down the street where the silver cloud sat quietly under the soft glow of the porch light. It gleamed faintly, like it knew we'd just won a battle together. But deep down, I knew Karen wasn't done. People like her never backed off icily. And sure enough, as I reached my door, I saw her standing across the street, her face hidden behind the curtains, watching me. The war wasn't over, not yet, but for the first time, I felt ready for whatever she had planned next. For a few weeks after the HOA meeting, things finally felt peaceful. The neighborhood settled into its usual rhythm, and even Karen seemed to have retreated into silence. I kept working on the Rolls Royce, now focusing on the finer details, polishing the chrome, reupholstering the seats, and restoring the steering wheel until it gleamed like it did in my grandfather's day. Each morning, I'd roll the silver cloud out into the sunlight, and the way it sparkled made every hour of sweat worth it. For the first time in months, I felt proud not just of the car, but of standing my ground. Then, one chilly Saturday morning, I woke to a pounding on my door. When I opened it, 2 uniformed police officers stood on my porch. My stomach dropped. Mr. Turner, one of them asked, "We've had a report regarding a possibly stolen vehicle parked on your property." My heart froze. Stolen wood? That's impossible, I said. The officer glanced past me toward the driveway where the Rolls sat gleaming. A Ms. Karen Price filed the report, he continued. She claims the car belongs to the homeowners association. I actually laughed, not out of humor, but disbelief. She what? I led them out to the driveway, trying to stay calm. Officers, that car has been in my possession for months. I bought it legally from a state auction. I have the title, the bill of sale, registration, everything. I opened my folder, the same one I'd carried to the HOA meeting, and handed over the papers. The older officer studied them carefully while his partner walked around the car, inspecting it. After a few minutes, the officer handed me back my documents and sighed. Everything looks clean. Mr. Turner, I'm sorry to bother you, but we have to follow up on reports like this. He paused. You said this was filed by your HOA president? Yes, I said tightly. Karen Price. She's been harassing me about this restoration since day one. He nodded, clearly familiar with the type. We deal with a lot of concerned citizens, he said with a knowing look. We'll note in our report that the claim was unfounded. They left shortly after, leaving me standing there with my blood boiling. I looked across the street. Sure enough, Karen stood at her window, pretending to water her plants, but watching everything. I could see the satisfaction on her face, even from a distance. That was it. Enough was enough. That afternoon, I went to the county clerk's office and requested a certified copy of my car's ownership documents. I even contacted the auction house to get a notarized statement verifying my purchase. I wanted every piece of paper that could legally prove this car was mine. When I got home, I made a folder labeled evidence. Karen and filed every document inside. Over the next few days, Karen's campaign escalated. Flyers appeared on neighbors' doors with phrases like, unauthorized vehicle activity in the community and protect our neighborhood standards. She didn't name me directly, but everyone knew who she was talking about. Some neighbors avoided eye contact, unsure whose side to take, but others began to quietly rally behind me. Mr. Jenkins even offered to testify if things went legal. Then came the worst blow. One morning, I went out to check on the car and found a bright yellow boot clamped to its front tire. I froze in disbelief. There was a note stuck to the windshield property of HOA until ownership dispute resolved. It was signed by none other than Karen Price, HOA president. That was illegal, and she knew it. The HOA had no authority to seize or restrain private property, especially something fully registered. I called the police again, and the same officer from before showed up. When he saw the boot, he shook his head. She's crossing a line now, he said. You have every right to have this removed. He made a call to the station, and within minutes, a tow truck arrived to take off the boot. As they worked, Karen came storming across the street, yelling, "You can't remove that. That's HOA property now." The officer turned toward her, his patience gone. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "this vehicle is legally owned by Mr. Turner. You are not authorized to place any device on it. If you continue interfering, we'll have to file a harassment report." Her face turned bright red, but for once she didn't have a comeback. She spun around and marched back to her house, slamming the door so hard it echoed down the street. The neighbors, who had gathered to watch the commotion, clapped softly as the tow truck freed the Rolls Royce. But later that evening, I sat in the garage, running my hand along the hood of the car. "We've been through a lot, huh?" I whispered. The silver cloud gleamed under the light, flawless and dignified, a living piece of history that refused to be taken down. But the joy of victory felt mixed with frustration. Karen wasn't just being petty now. She was trying to destroy something meaningful. I decided to take the fight further. I wrote a detailed report of every incident. The false complaint, the boot, the flyers, the harassment, and sent it all to the county attorney's office along with the police reports. Within days, I got a call confirming they were opening an investigation into the HOA's conduct. When the letter of inquiry arrived at Karen's mailbox, I was standing outside, waxing the car. She stormed out to check her mail, opened the envelope, and froze. Her face turned pale as she read the first few lines, realizing what it was. Then she glanced up and saw me watching. I didn't say a word. I just gave her a polite nod and went back to polishing the silver cloud. For the first time since moving into this neighborhood, I felt like justice was finally catching up with her. But deep down, I knew Karen wasn't the type to surrender quietly. She'd find another way to strike back. What she didn't know, though, was that I had one last surprise waiting. Something that would turn the tables for good. And soon. She'd learn that you don't pick a fight with a man who builds his legacy from rust and steel. Because he knows how to rebuild anything, even his own revenge. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the garage windows and reflected off the newly polished silver hood of the Rolls. The sight made me smile. It wasn't just a car anymore. It was a symbol of patience, persistence, and the quiet power of standing your ground. But that piece was about to be tested for the final time. Around 9, a tow truck pulled up in front of my driveway. The engine idled loudly, and behind it, as expected, stood Karen, arms folded, sunglasses on, and a clipboard in her hand. She looked proud, certain she'd finally won. "Mr. Hayes," she called, stepping forward with exaggerated authority. "As per HOA bylaws, any unregistered vehicle left in public view can be impounded. I've arranged for this vehicle to be removed today." I leaned against the car.com as ever. "That's interesting," I said, nodding toward the gleaming license plate. "Because this car is not unregistered. It's fully restored and legally titled under my name. Care to take a closer look?" Karen froze for a moment, her confidence faltering as she noticed the brand new registration sticker. She flipped through her papers, stammering, That can't be. "I checked last week." I smiled. "You checked before I finished the restoration. And before the DMV confirmed my ownership through the classic car registry." The tow truck driver looked between us, unsure. "Ma'am, if the car's registered and on private property, I can't touch it," he said cautiously. Karen's voice rose, her composure cracking. "No. This car used to belong to my friend who lived here years ago. It's part of community property. Now, that was my cue." I gestured toward the man approaching from across the street, Mr. Bennett, the retired attorney who'd recently moved in and happened to specialize in property disputes. He carried a folder under his arm, his face serious. "I thought this might happen," he said, handing me a document. "Here's the confirmation from the DMV and the original sale transfer record. Karen, this vehicle was auctioned off legally 8 years ago. It hasn't belonged to anyone else since." Karen's face turned crimson. "This isn't fair. You can't keep everything you find and pretend it's yours," she snapped. I took a step closer and said evenly, "It's called restoring history, not stealing it. You've mistaken pride for ownership, and control for community." Mr. Bennett nodded. "You've overstepped, Karen. Again. If you continue harassing Mr. Hayes or interfering with his property, you'll be facing a legal injunction." The tow truck backed away, and Karen stood there, trembling with fury, her perfect little plan crumbling in front of her neighbors. Several residents had gathered on the sidewalks by now, watching quietly. Some of them even clapped when I turned on the Rolls Royce engine, a deep, smooth rumble that filled the street like a declaration of victory. Karen stormed off, muttering about lawyers and unfair rules, but the damage to her reputation was done. Within a week, the HOA board held a special meeting, and several members demanded her resignation for misuse of authority. She was forced to step down. Life in the neighborhood changed after that. People began waving more often, stopping to chat about the car, asking me for advice on their own projects. The same neighbors who once kept their blinds drawn now dropped by with coffee or cookies, curious about the restoration details. The street felt lighter, freer, like everyone had taken a deep breath after years of control. A month later, I entered the Rolls Royce in a local classic car show. The crowd gathered around it in awe, admiring the glossy chrome and the spotless leather interior. The judges awarded it Best Restoration. And as I stood there holding the small golden trophy, I couldn't help but think of that first day I found the car under a tarp, forgotten and broken. Sometimes, beauty isn't discovered, it's rebuilt. When I returned home that evening, I parked the Rolls in its usual spot and sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The neighborhood was quiet, the air filled with the soft hum of crickets. Across the street, Karen's house was dark. She had listed it for sale a week earlier. I took one last look at the silver cloud under the streetlight. Its silver coat shimmered faintly, like a ghost brought back to life. I smiled and whispered to myself, "You and me, old friend, we made it." The car's hood ornament, the spirit of ecstasy, caught the light just right, almost like it was bowing in gratitude. That night, as I closed my garage door, I felt a sense of finality. The car's journey and mine had come full circle. Sometimes, justice doesn't roar. Sometimes, it purrs softly under the hood of a well-restored engine. If you enjoyed this story of revenge, justice, and redemption, don't forget to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. Subscribe to HOA Bright Reality for more incredible real-life stories that will leave you speechless.